Hey everyone. As promised, I just wanted to give an overview of State v. Cole. And State v. Cole, you'll remember, is the companion case to State v. Worley. So what this video will go over is just a similar breakdown of State v. Cole, just as we did for State v. Worley. But before we get started, let's go back and remember our benchmarks just so that we can put them fresh in our mind before we begin to break down State v. Cole. So our benchmarks, we have 7 of them. And so you'll remember that each one stresses a different type of information that cases should or may contain. And again, for each one, they all have different pieces of information in the case that they emphasize or that they represent. And so the first one is our facts. And for facts, remember that facts are the story of how that case got into court. It really gives you the background of why the parties ended up suing each other and what the main problem was between them. And so that really is all that facts represent. They read like stories because they are stories. The second one is procedural history, and you'll remember that procedural history also are facts. They're just facts of a different type. And procedural history facts are when the case gets into court. It stresses what happened during trial, who won, and who appealed, right? So were there who were their convictions, things that really involve what happened when the case was in the courtroom setting. And then we get to our third benchmark, which is the issue. And remember that the issue is the question that the court is trying to solve. And there are 2 different types of issues. They both focus on different things. Procedural issues focus on when there was an issue with how the case happened in the court system below. Maybe some improper evidence was considered by the jury, and it shouldn't have been according to the rules of procedure, right? So if there was a problem procedurally with something that happened in the litigation system, that's a procedural issue. There's also a substantive issue. And substantive issues are where it's more of a question of law. Has this ever been discussed before? Do we need to consider it? Does this statute apply to this situation? They're more questions of thought and of reasoning about the law and whether it applies to certain situations. Each issue, because it's a question, should have an answer, and that answer is our holding. And so you'll remember that for each issue, you should have a holding, and the holding should answer that issue. We get to our remaining benchmarks, and we have reasoning of the court, and reasoning is tricky because it's everywhere. It's the court really letting us know how they get from the question of the issue to the answer that is the holding. And so frequently when courts are reasoning, they're giving their rationale for why they're making the decision that they are about to make. And so they'll consider cases, and they'll consider laws, they'll consider constitutions, and they'll consider dictionaries for definitions. And all of these things inform how they come to their holding. Reasoning is tricky at first. It takes some practice to sort of figure out what really is crucial to the court coming to their holding. And so if this seems overwhelming at first, I would just recommend that you be flexible and you push on and you start to get more practice. And the more practice you have, the easier it will be for you to spot relevant reasoning. Judgment is probably the easiest benchmark to a certain extent because, again, it is only signified by a couple of words. Judgment is shown by the presence of affirmed, reversed, or remanded. And remember, if a judgment is affirmed, that means that everything that happened below in the lower courts was fine. The court now reviewing that decision doesn't have any issue with it. If something is reversed, that means that something was wrong or it should never have been law in the first place. And a lot of times when something is reversed, it is also remanded. It is sent back down to the lower court that made the error with some instructions on how they need to reweigh this case in the future. Occasionally, your cases will have additional court opinions after the majority opinion. Do not skip those. You will want to read them because each one of those opinions raises different points. There are two types of extra opinions, concurring and dissenting. Concurring opinions is where the person concurring agrees with the end result, but they might not agree with all of the reasons for the decision. And so they explain why and what they might have done differently. Dissenting disagrees both with the reasoning and the result. They don't like anything about it. And so they, again, will give some information about what their problem was with the majority's ruling and discuss how they would have ruled in the alternative sometimes, just to let the reader know what their main problem was. I would encourage you to leave additional space for your comments or questions so that you have them in class. Again, there's something really validating when you're in class and another classmate asks a question that was on your case brief. So you'll want to take note of those. So remember that in Worley, there were two kind of small issues. The first was, did the trial court make an error when they refused in allowing him that defense? And the other was, should we extend the necessity defense to folks in Worley's situation? Well, the answer that the court came to was that yes, we can extend the necessity defense as being an option to consider to prisoners in Worley's situation if 6 criteria are met. Now, as a result of Worley, we now have a rule as it applies to prisoners in his situation. And what that means is that going forward, any prisoners who find themselves in a similar situation as Worley did are able to have the necessity defense considered if they meet the 6 criteria required. But what about anyone else that might be seeking to use the necessity defense, right? Are there other groups of people that might also want to try to use this defense? And if so, what is the court supposed to do about that? So when we consider the holdings of Worley and how the court came to its ultimate holdings in that case and the reasoning that they use, we're now going to see how the court uses the same sort of approach to consider necessity for another group of individuals. Now, when the court does that, what they're going to be doing is using Worley as precedent. And precedent are things that came before whatever the court is considering. The things that came before that inform what the court may or may not do. So for instance, the court generally might look at the necessity defense and say, well, have we ever extended this to anyone else outside of what the legislature provided? Well, yeah, they did. They extended it in Worley. And so they have a context where they have made that available to people in a different way. So we now have the case of State v. Cole, and State v. Cole challenges the court to do the same sort of work, right? To figure out what the necessity defense is if it's made available to folks in a different situation. If you have not read State v. Cole, I would recommend that you take just a couple of minutes to do that and try and note these basic benchmarks. If you want to try and note them all, I think that you can do that. But the main thing I would do is just to make sure that you have an answer to all of these. And once you do, you can watch the second video.